This morning, please turn with me to 2 Chronicles chapter 36. And some of you are probably going, oh no, Old Testament again. And I'm going to give you a lot of history on this morning, but I also want us to see how so much of what happened some thousands of years ago, a couple thousand years ago or three, how it looks like it's repeating itself all over again. 2 Chronicles chapter 36. The kingdom of Israel was once 12 nations. It became divided, and 10 tribes of Israel, still called Israel, they separated themselves, and then it had Israel and Judah. Judah was where Jerusalem was at. Judah was the only kingdom that after the division that would occasionally come back and worship God. And I say occasionally. Israel was became a nation that, because they was afraid that if the people went back to Jerusalem, to the temple of God to worship, that they might go back, they set up their own type of religion and never really worshiped God again. And because of that, out of the two kingdoms, two tribes, or two nations that came out of Israel, the 10, the larger one, was the first one to fall. In Judah, the kingdom of Judah, the kings would come along, and one of them would be a really good king and be leading the people back to God and really promoting the things of God, and then maybe his successor would come along and lead them just in the opposite direction. And they may go 2 or 3 kingdoms, and they would get just really in a mess, and then God would raise up another king, and he would lead the people back. And it just kept going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth throughout the history. At this point, this has went on for a long period of time. Manasseh was a king who did evil in the sight of God in everything that he touched. But after he died, he had a son who took over as king at 8 years old. Now imagine an 8-year-old king. And the first thing it says about Josiah, whenever you look him up in the Bible, is that he did right in the sight of the Lord. And he started making reforms. And by the age of 16, he was trying to get the temple cleaned up and back in order. Now imagine that the house of God, the temple of God that was specifically built for God, was in such disorder and disarray that they had to bring in all the priests to try and clean it up. And whenever they were cleaning it up, they came across something that they didn't even know that they had, and that was the book of the law. This is how bad things had gotten. And whenever they got the book of the law and they started reading it, they realized that all the things that they were doing wrong. And they brought it to Josiah, the king, and presented it to him and told him what was going on. And he heard some of the words of it, and he realized that the wrath of God was about to fall on the nation of Israel because they were so far from where God wanted them to be. And so he calls all the elders and all the people, great and small, and all the priests, and they come to the temple, and he has them stand while the book of the law was read to them. And then he made a commitment that day and had asked the people to join him in that commitment to return back to the things of God, tearing down all of the idol worships, all the pagan rituals, and all the pagan things that were going on, and return back to God. In time, they even got to the point where they had restored the Passover, the annual celebration of the Passover. That's how far it had gotten away. And yet, during his tenure, he continued and continued to try and promote the things of God and restore proper worship. God had spoken to him and says, I have decided that this place is going to fall, but because that your heart is tender towards me and because you have a repentant heart, he says it will not happen in your lifetime. And so Josiah lived out his days until he got killed in battle. After he got killed in battle is where we're taken up on verse 1 of chapter 36. It says, Then the people of the land took Joahaz, the son of Josiah, and made him king in place of his father in Jerusalem. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. Then the king of Egypt deposed him at Jerusalem and imposed on the land a fine of 100 talents of silver and 1 talent of gold. And the king of Egypt made Eliakim, his brother, king over Judah and Jerusalem, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. But Necho took Jehoahaz, his brother, and brought him to Egypt. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, his God. Stop right there for just a little bit. I love these names. And I'd like to hear how they're supposed to actually be pronounced, but that's beyond me. Josiah did his best to serve God. And then after he was warned not to go to battle against Egypt, he was killed. And Egypt comes in after he dies and puts his son in place. After 3 months, Egypt comes in and deposes his son, takes him out, takes him back to Egypt, and puts Eliakim, whom he renames to Jehoiakim, in his place. Now, there's a significance in the name change. When Egypt took and replaced with Jehoiakim with the new name, it signifies that he was under the control of Egypt. He was not his own man. He was not God's own man. He was under control. So they was already under the oppression of Egypt at this time. But only 3 months has passed since Josiah has been king, who is a godly king. And what does it say right off the bat about Jehoiakim? That he did evil in the sight of the Lord his God. How quickly things turned. How quickly. Now pick up verse 6. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against him and bound him with bronze chains to take him to Babylon. This is after 11 years. Nebuchadnezzar also brought some of the articles of the house of the Lord to Babylon and put them in his temple at Babylon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and the abominations which he did, and what was found against him, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. And Jehoiachin, his son, became king in his place. Jehoiachin was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Isn't that encouraging? His father, who reigned for 11 years and was under oppression of the Egyptians, and now Nebuchadnezzar, the king from the north of Babylon, has come and gotten rid of him and puts his son, who is 8, and another reference in the book of Kings that says he was 18. At either rate, it doesn't matter. But it says the one thing about it, he was only there for 3 months and 10 days, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Keep reading. And at the turn of the year, King Nebuchadnezzar sent and brought him to Babylon with the valuable articles of the house of the Lord, and he made his kinsman Zedekiah king over Judah and Jerusalem. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord his God, and he did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, who spoke for the Lord. And he also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear allegiance by God, but he stiffened his neck and hardened his heart against turning to the Lord God of Israel. Furthermore, all the officials of the priests and the people were very unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations, and they defiled the house of the Lord, which he had sanctified in Jerusalem. And the Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them again and again by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. That's pretty powerful words. God has sent prophet after prophet after prophet saying, turn back, turn back, turn back. Don't follow in this way. Don't do this. And they abused the prophets, and they killed some of the prophets. And in Jeremiah's case, they threw him down into a cistern because they didn't like his message. Until it came to the point where the people refused to follow God, and the king refused to follow God, until God says, there's no fixing this. There's just no fixing this. Therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on the young man or virgin, old man or infirm. He gave them all into his hand, and all the articles of the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king of his officers, he brought them all to Babylon. And they burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all its fortified buildings with fire and destroyed all its valuable articles. And those who had escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, and they were servants to him and to his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation it kept Sabbath until 70 years were complete. This was the fall and the end of Jerusalem, of Judea, of the nation of Israel. And it was based upon, even though that they would come back every once in a while, then it got to the point to where there was no coming back. They all began to continue to follow after their own selfish lust and their own selfish ambitions. And the last king that served, because of his stiff neck, because of his unwillingness to listen to Jeremiah the prophet, saw one of the most horrific disasters of all of Israel. He witnessed it with his own eyes. Look it up and read it. It's sad to see how far we can go trying to defend our own evil ways. It really is. Now then, how did they get into that position? How did they get to the place to where just 3 months after a godly king was on the throne, that the next king says, I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm not going to follow after my father. I'm going to follow after myself. I'm going to go against everything that he did, and I'm going to go my own way. That's why it says he did evil in the sight of the Lord. You know, Jeremiah, the prophet, was faced with a people who knew about God but did not know God. They would go through the rituals of sacrifice and service, but they never had that relationship. I appreciated Julie's children's moment this morning because it talked about having that relationship with God. And without having that relationship, we're just kind of bouncing back and forth. You know, the church in our world today, I'm afraid, is too much in that same position as to where they know a little bit about God, but they don't have that personal relationship with God. And why do I say that? It's because as soon as something goes a little south, then they're gone. They're going to find another church where makes them feel good. But to stick it out and to trust God and to find out what the problem is and then try to fix that problem and solve that problem, It's something that's been lacking for the last several years. And so it's once that you have tasted the pleasures of sin, it's hard to go back and do without it. Let me give you an example. I love hearing babies, and I think I heard Kim talk about that little Rolla is about to go on solid food here for too long. Remember feeding your babies out of that Gerber bottle, and you put those squashed peas in there, those in their mouth, and they're just so hungry, they just eat it all up. And they feed them stuff like sweet potatoes. It's just nasty stuff. And the kids don't know any different, and they just eat it up, and they just act like they just love it. Until you feed them something from the table, and it's got seasoning in it, and it's got salt in it, and heaven forbid, it's got sugar in it. Guess where those peas and sweet potatoes go from that point on? You try to go back to that Gerber bottle, and it's just going to go all over the place. They are not going to have any more of that. And if you let a child decide what they want to eat, you better have a lot of sugar, because they're going to pick that every time. It's our human nature. I mean, as adults, we still do the same thing. I mean, we would still rather have a burger and fries than green beans and corn any day. I mean, who wouldn't? But we finally, as we get older, we're supposed to learn that there is an outcome to what we put in. And that was the thing that people still are having trouble recognizing yet today. I don't believe any addict has ever started out thinking, I want to just get so totally dependent on this that my health is gone and my life is gone and my family is gone and everything that I care deeply about, I'll just throw away so that I can be addicted to whatever this is. But once they taste that, once they experience that drug or whatever it is, and it gets a hold of them, it's awful hard. It's a battle. I mean, a serious battle to overcome that. And sin is the exact same way. Once we experience something that satisfies just for the moment, even though in our minds we can tell ourselves, long term, this is not good, we're very prone to go back and repeat it again and again and again. That's what was happening with Israel. They had experienced the pagan religions, and they had forgotten about the God who had brought them to that place in the first place. They had forgotten that their fathers used to be slaves in Egypt who didn't have any say over what they did in a day, who didn't have any real ownership of anything, but was under the thumb of somebody else. And they had forgotten all the miracles that had taken place that God had performed to bring them out of that place and bring them into a land that was flowing with milk and honey. They had forgotten all of the many times where God had went to battle for them and won that battle victoriously, and they had forgotten about it. They knew enough to go through the traditions, to go through the rituals, but they didn't really know the God that they were serving. And every year, every generation, they just kept getting farther and farther and farther away. Imagine coming into church next Sunday and we decide to have a cleaning day and somebody goes, I found a Bible. What's this? What's in it? I've heard something about that, but what is it? Imagine what that would imagine the feeling that you would get whenever you realize that, this is what this is all based on, and we know nothing about it. But we know that we do this, and we do this, and we do this, and we do this, and we do it every Sunday. And that's where the people were. And then after they found the Bible, they says, that's good, but unless somebody's here to enforce it, we're going to go back to our own ways. We're just going to go back and doing the things that we want to do, irregardless. Now, there's good news in this. As we see what happened to Israel, and we see that it finally come to the point to where after completely just ignoring God and pushing God away and just absolutely having nothing to do with him over and over and over and over again, that finally God says there's no remedy for this people. And so he does not send the destruction on it. He backs off and allows it to happen. And it does. But even then, it says that he had a time frame of how long it was going to last, until the 70 years was passed, which had already been prophesied. 70 years that they was going to be under strict oppression. They was not going to have, the temple had been robbed, destroyed, and burnt down. The gates of Jerusalem had been all torn down and burnt. But God had a time frame. There is always redemption with God. No matter where any of us have ever been, no matter what any of us have ever done, there's always an opportunity for redemption. And that's the good news. The nation of Israel found redemption. Many, probably most of us here, have at one point experienced that same redemption. I pray that everybody has. They found that maybe the direction that they were going wasn't where they needed to be. And whenever they realized who God was, and they realized that God really did care for them, then they realized this is what they need in their life. That's my story. But I cannot, even though I can forget the guilt of my past sins, I cannot forget the deliverance from those sins. Because in forgetting the deliverance from those sins, I forget God. And when I forget God, I start thinking I did this myself. And I know that I didn't. I didn't. Now, we're into a little over halfway into the first month. But there's a lot ahead of this year. And the one thing that I do not want to let slide in this coming year is for us to be telling our stories. What happened to Israel was they forgot who they were. And so they was always out there trying to find themselves. How many times have you heard that in today's society? Oh, you just need to find yourself. You need to find who you are. And if you don't know, just pull something out of the air and base it on that. The enemy loves confusion, because the more confusion there is, the less people understand what's really going on. But whenever we look at what is going on in this world, it tells us that people are honestly, desperately, eagerly searching for something. And maybe they are going through something just like what you've been through. And if we keep our stories and our testimonies to ourselves, we're not going to help them. Because it's our little secret. We need to be telling what God has done for our life. We need to be refreshed about what God has already done, and then be willing to share it with somebody else. Because if you look at the history of Israel, because they continued to follow after their own ways instead of the ways of God, what ultimately happened to the nation of Israel? It was destroyed. It was wiped out. And God says, there's no fixing this people. Can you in any way, shape, or form see that same thing happening in our world today? You know, I honestly believe that it's getting close to that time to where God is just going to say, you know, I'm just going to let you go about your own way. You're dead set on getting there anyway. But then I think of Jonah. Remember Jonah? And he goes to Nineveh, and he says, I don't want to go because they're just going to repent. But through a course of events, he goes anyway. And what do? They turn to God. Our focus for this coming year, I believe, as a church, should be turning people to God, reminding them of what He has done in the past, but also to let them know what He's doing right now. You know, we have seen, just in this past week, we have seen sub-zero temperatures, 25-mile-an-hour winds, and cloudy skies. How many just really enjoyed being out those days? Not me. But you walk out there today, I can look out that window, I can look through the stained glass, any one of them, and see the sun is shining brightly. God didn't forsake us. And He's not forsaking us now. He's offering us hope, and He's offering us promise. God is working all around us if we'll just open our eyes to see Him. And if we see Him, we need to acknowledge Him. It's always good, like I shared earlier, to give thanks. Even whenever you can't hardly think of anything to give thanks for. That's when it's most important. Because somebody needs a bright spot. Somebody needs an encouragement. Because the devil is out there saying, oh, you need to go this way. You need to try this. You need to try this. You need to try this. When God's people should be standing up and saying, but this never changes. This never goes away. This is real. This is eternal. And this is what brings true peace. How do I know that? The first song we sang. How do I know that? Because He did it in me. He did it in me. Did He do it in you? Did He do it in you? And if He did, would you be willing to share it? You know, Christianity is the one thing that whenever you give it away, everybody gains. Nobody loses. This morning, as we are gathered here to worship, I pray that as we go into this coming year, I know it's 21 days into it, but why wait till next year to start? Open my eyes, Lord, to see what You're doing, and then open my mouth to repeat it. Because I never want You to give up on us. If the Lord's spoken to your heart this morning about any decision you need to make, as we stand to sing the hymn of invitation, won't you respond accordingly? So we stand to sing, I Have Decided to Follow Jesus, number 5.